I'm sideways?
You're sideways.
You're sideways.
You're sideways.
Who is that?
Am I upside down?
Huh?
Yeah, no. There you go. Nailed it.
Somersault.
Well, we'll see how long I might tip over.
But I guess I got the coach.
Recording in progress.
That's it. One of those costs.
Yeah, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you. I apologize for my appearance. This is camping Dana.
Yeah, I can hear you as well. Thanks.
It doesn't look like a tent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little upgrade.
Everyone ready in 15? Okay. Okay, the joint work session between the planning commission and the city council of Gearhart is now called forward. Garrett, we're going to go right to you so you can start us off with all the information you want to give us. All right, thank you. I'm not using a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll provide you with a brief overview of why we asked to have the meeting and what kind of input we're asking from you this evening. So your packet includes a memo that I wrote and that other staff have had the chance to review. And then we've included some attachments to that as well. The reason we're meeting is because the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which oversees our floodplain management activities, has told the city of Gearhart and many other Oregon communities this summer that we have to make changes to our zoning ordinance to implement the Endangered Species Act and protect endangered species in floodplains. And so they have indicated that we have to make a decision on how we're going to respond to their requirement by December 1st. And they provided us with a few options on how we could respond. And so I was going to review those with you, and we want to ask for your input on what our next step should be and how you think you'd like to respond to the new requirements, or what additional information you'd like us to find and present to you so that you feel informed enough to give us that direction. So the FEMA requirements to protect endangered species in floodplains, they have offered 3 different basic options that we can use. The first one is to prohibit all new development in floodplains. And that addresses the Endangered Species Act by, preventing the impacts of development on salmon habitat and potentially other endangered or threatened species. So that's superficially a very simple approach, although we wouldn't recommend taking that approach for reasons I can get into more. If any of you are interested in it, we can discuss it more. A second option is to adopt a model floodplain ordinance that FEMA and the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development have created together. And if a city adopts the model floodplain ordinance, then it will be considered compliant with the new requirements. The third option is to amend the floodplain ordinance that we currently have to require sort of a custom site specific analysis of any applicant that comes in to request a floodplain development permit. So I'm going to review some key aspects of the model ordinance and then the habitat assessment guidelines. So the model ordinance basically looks at salmon habitat impacts and really tries to simplify the ways that development impacts salmon and how we can avoid those impacts. And it boils it down to 3 factors. One is the amount of space within the floodplain that buildings and fill and other things that we put there take up. And it basically views things like that, like earth material that we put in the floodplain or a building, as literally taking up habitat that a salmon could otherwise occupy. And it says that you can't occupy any additional volume or space in the floodplain. If you do, you have to mitigate that by removing other things from the floodplain. So that's the first requirement, is it's under the title of undeveloped space or developed space. So that and the other 2, I'll just say are in section 6 of the model ordinance that you have. Section 6 is, it starts on page, let's see. I'll get it for you so you can follow along with me. We'll just take a sec. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, so it's the 42nd page of the model ordinance, or it's otherwise labeled at the bottom as page 3-29.
We don't have.
We don't
any of
have that
that.
yet.
We have it electronically, but not here.
Okay. All right, well, section 6.1.1 is about undeveloped space, and I just discussed that. You basically can't add things that take up space to the floodplain. If you do, you have to mitigate for that by removing other things from the floodplain. And there's some specific standards to follow in that regard.
Can you clarify what you mean by that? I mean, are we talking about like decks? Are we talking about pavers? Are we talking about things like that? Or are we talking about building structures? Or all of the above?
Yeah, so the model ordinance doesn't say what like the minimum, like obviously a deck takes up some space. There's volume involved in deck materials, right? And the model ordinance doesn't specify a minimum threshold where this requirement gets triggered.
So the answer is yes, it's all of the above.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
The second sort of component of habitat protection in floodplains is the infiltration of stormwater, and it's in the section 6.1.2, impervious surfaces. This essentially says that you cannot add additional impervious surfaces within the floodplain. So that would be typically like traditional road materials like asphalt, driveway materials like asphalt. The roof of a building is impervious. So these things basically create more stormwater running off more quickly across the landscape, and oftentimes they cause stormwater to collect additional pollutants that run into streams as well. And so the idea is the basic requirement is you cannot add these things to the floodplain either. But if you do, you can mitigate additional impervious surfaces by designing your project so that stormwater runs off of them into areas where it can infiltrate into the ground. And in some cases into special facilities like bioswales, where it can be treated and infiltrate and clean pollutants more effectively, or an infiltration basin where the water can be collected and allowed to infiltrate over time instead of all running off right away into streams. So far we've reviewed developable space and impervious surfaces. The third basic habitat component that they focused on in the ordinance is trees. And the ordinance states that there shall not be a net loss of trees that are greater than 6 inches in diameter, measured at chest height. So the removal of trees from the floodplain that are greater than 6 inches in diameter would be prohibited, except that if you really want to do that, you can plant replacement trees to mitigate for the impacts of removing the trees that you removed.
So Garrett, so does that mean that you can cut down old growth trees and then just plant new trees to replace them?
Yes, this ordinance doesn't differentiate between, again, the threshold is 6 inches, and it does not differentiate between the protections for a 7-inch tree or a 100-inch diameter tree. The mitigation requirements do vary. So I'll get into the mitigation requirements in a minute, but for larger trees, you would have to plant more replacement trees than you would for removing smaller trees. And again, the purpose of this ordinance is Endangered Species Act compliance and protecting salmon habitat. And so a lot of the values that we might place on extraordinarily large trees, while a very large tree might have more benefit for some endangered species than a moderate sized tree, our sort of aesthetic preferences, that's not what the purpose, that's not what FEMA is trying to speak to with this ordinance. So you all might have heard, some of you might have heard, when hearing about the FEMA biological opinion that is the driver for these requirements, about a riparian buffer zone. And there's been some discussion amongst people that like to talk about this stuff about a 170-foot riparian buffer. And I just wanted to speak to that. And so the model ordinance does include something called a riparian buffer. And it actually speaks to a 170-foot riparian buffer. But I want to be clear that those requirements I just talked about for developed space, impervious surfaces, and trees, those apply throughout the FEMA 100-year floodplain, okay? With the model ordinance, the riparian buffer is a place where the mitigation requirements, if you're gonna have some impacts, the mitigation requirements are greater if those impacts are occurring within 170 feet of the stream. And the idea is that impacts that are within 170 feet of the stream that a floodplain surrounds, that's gonna, that'll impact salmon habitat more than impacts that occur further than 170 feet away. So moving through the model ordinance, there are some special provisions about stormwater management. This particularly in section 6.2, stormwater management goes back to and refers to the impervious surface requirements. It provides extra guidance on how you have to manage stormwater that flows off of new impervious surfaces that you're creating within the floodplain. And it would require designed stormwater infiltration facilities designed by an engineer. And oftentimes they involve a landscape architect as well, to meet some specific standards here in terms of how much stormwater they're supposed to be able to handle. And so I just wanted to highlight that. And then the ordinance goes on to provide some exemptions in section 6.3, where activities like maintaining a structure, like re-roofing, and a variety of other practices actually are not subject to these requirements. And then finally, section 6.4, the riparian buffer zone. This speaks to what I was just talking about, where the mitigation requirements are greater within 170 feet of the stream that the floodplain surrounds. And finally, there's a table at the end, which is important, and it speaks to all of the sections I just discussed. And it describes the mitigation requirements for taking up space within the floodplain, adding impervious surfaces, or removing trees. And this table differentiates between the actual floodway, which is a very relatively small part of a floodplain, and the rest of the floodplain. So in Gearhart, I'd really look at what's in the row that says RBZ fringe in this table 1. And you can imagine for impervious surfaces, if you add 100 square feet of driveway, so you just want to add a little turnaround or something, and somehow you've gotten it down to 100 square feet, you're adding some driveway to a place that was just grass in the floodplain, you would have to find a way to remove 100 square feet of impervious surface from your site or another site in the floodplain in order to get a permit to build that driveway extension. Then there are some additional considerations for mitigating on-site versus off-site. So if you want to do your mitigation off-site, it would actually be 200 square feet, double the amount that you would have to do on-site. So this is, just conceptually, I wanted to review the model ordinance. And we can discuss the details of this tonight. And if we move forward in the conversation, we'll be discussing the details more in coming meetings. The habitat assessment guidelines compared to the model ordinance are relatively subjective. The habitat assessment guidelines provide a process that an applicant and city staff would follow to design a project in the floodplain, evaluate the impacts that it could have on habitat, identify ways that they could avoid those impacts or mitigate for them, and then for the city to evaluate and decide whether a permit should be issued. And the habitat assessment guidelines, it's several dozen pages long of guidance on what applicants and local governments should do if they want to allow site-specific, case-by-case analysis of habitat impacts when they're issuing permits, instead of following the model ordinance. The habitat assessment guidelines and the process that they outline remind me a lot of the standard process that's followed by local governments in Washington state when someone wants to develop over water or adjacent to water bodies that have salmon in them. So they call them critical areas reports, and they have to have typically a biologist do a site visit and prepare a pretty detailed analysis of the existing resources and how they could be impacted, how they're going to avoid the impacts, and why the development should be permitted. And so that's the kind of thing that would be required under the habitat assessment guidelines for development in the floodplain if the city chose to go that route. We would have to adopt floodplain development ordinance amendments in order to require that kind of information from an applicant, and in order for you to give staff the authority to approve or deny permits based on that information. So both of those options imply code amendments. So I'd say finally that the compliance with the requirements can come through a combination of any of those three options. So the one that we highlighted in the memo is that the city could choose to both adopt the model ordinance, but also add some additional content that authorizes the use of habitat assessments by floodplain development applicants. So it would give people the option of following the relatively clear standards of the model ordinance, or following the habitat assessment guidelines. Now, I'd say that even with the model ordinance, meeting the developed space requirement and the impervious surface requirement will oftentimes, it seems, require employing a professional to assist you, like an engineer, to assist with making the determinations to show that you're compliant. But it could also, I can also see a lot of situations where an application could be more straightforward with the model ordinance. So in any case, again, FEMA said that cities and other local governments are supposed to make a decision by December 1st, and that applications that are received by local governments after December 1st are supposed to be subject to the new standards. And every local government representative I've spoken with and have heard comment in a series of webinars hosted by FEMA that I've attended all agree that that's not a practical deadline to meet. And the immediate consequence of not meeting that deadline would be that sometime in early 2025, FEMA will start to ask us if we've received any floodplain development applications and how we made our decisions on whether or not to permit them. I don't think we've received one since I've been working for the city of Gearhart in over a year and a half, or I haven't been asked to review one. After FEMA asked for whether we permitted something since December 1st, if we somehow did and we didn't have these standards in place, they could ask to have a community assistance visit with us, where they come and visit Gearhart and write us a letter documenting the visit and explaining what will happen if we don't meet their requirements. And I don't know what the ultimate timeline in terms of consequences, but I think it's a fair assumption that they would lay out a schedule stating that, if you're not compliant by this date, your participation in the National Flood Insurance Program would be suspended. And I'm happy to, review why we're a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program and what the benefits are of that, if you'd like to. But it's, almost all local governments participate, and there's some benefits for local residents and benefits for the local government itself in terms of its finances and risk management. So our basic question to Planning Commission and City Council is, are you interested in pursuing one or multiple of these options? or what else, what other information do you need, or would you like in order to feel like you can make a recommendation in that regard?
Well, Garrett, I got a question for you, and that's about the hybrid model ordinance and habitat assessment. In
Yeah.
all of information from FEMA, I've read 3 specific items that they want you to do, and that's, the prohibition, the model ordinance, and the habitat assessment. I did not read anywhere or see a hint that they would be accepting a hybrid between 2 of them. And I just wondered, did I miss something, or do you know something, because you've gone to more of these FEMA meetings than I have, that allows us to combine 2 or more of these and make the requirement that they want?
Yeah, so they've said in at least one of the webinars that you can do that. And if you're interested in doing it and using a hybrid approach, or whatever approach you say you're interested in doing after tonight, one of the first things that we're going to do is reach out to them and tell them that we're beginning to work on this approach, and how can we involve you to make sure that we're staying on the right track and not creating surprises. But yes, in the webinar, they confirmed that you could do a hybrid approach. I've found the communication with FEMA confusing in some other regards. Like, you would think that they would offer that and say they would anticipate that some people might want to do a hybrid approach and speak to it up front. The December 1st deadline, they've been a bit vague about that as well. It felt like, you'll notice in the letter that they don't say what happens if you don't meet the December 1st deadline. And what I told you about the deadline is gleaned from those webinars as well. Like, it's verbal communication about something that's supposed to be pretty serious, and typically you'd think would be in writing. So that's the environment we're working in, and the way that we're gonna make sure that we're doing things the right way is to just proactively communicate during the process going forward. So.
Okay, well, I don't know what the group is going to decide, though this is a work session and we can't decide, but we can indicate our preference. But I would want to get something in writing from FEMA ASAP if we're going to go with something like a hybrid, because I don't want to spend any time doing something that turns around and goes, oh, sorry, that isn't going to work for us.
Okay.
All right,
Can we ask some questions, Garrett?
yes.
Yeah, Garrett, I have a question for you. Okay, is it to protect endangered species, and we're only talking about salmon as the only endangered species? Is that correct?
The model ordinance and the habitat assessment guidelines are really oriented towards salmon. And broadly speaking, like long term, if there was some other endangered species that popped up, FEMA could say that you have to, that it applies to that too. But they've said, look, if you follow the model ordinance, which is clearly just about salmon habitat, I mean, that's what those regulations are designed to address, then you're on the right side of the rules.
Okay, yes, on your map, we show the blue Gearhart floodplains, and blue, purple, and pink. So are you talking about 170-foot buffer zone right and left to all of those areas that are in blue or the purple?
So the habitat assessment guidelines, if we go that route, or the model ordinance, applies to all areas in the blue and pink. And then if those within the blue and pink areas, if you're developing within 170 feet of the stream, then the mitigation requirements you have to meet are greater than if you're further than 170 feet from the stream. But those things I was talking about, like no new impervious surfaces, or else you have to mitigate for it, that is throughout the floodplain. It's just that if you're within 170 feet of the stream, then you have to mitigate more for the impacts you create. If the floodplain on either side of a stream is only 50 feet wide, then the 170 feet actually ends at 50 feet. Okay, it doesn't go beyond the edge of the floodplain. This only applies when someone has to get a floodplain development permit, which only applies when you're in the 100-year floodplain. And the FEMA requirements do not require any change of our floodplain mapping. So we're not talking about changing the boundaries of our floodplains right now at all.
So then the 170-foot riparian zone, you said doesn't apply where the floodplain zone is like 50 feet out from the stream. Is that
That's
what you
right.
said?
Yes, this only applies to the edge of the floodplain.
Wait, I'm still not getting it.
If you got a floodplain at 50 feet, and you're saying that it goes 170 feet beyond the floodplain, doesn't that make that 220? Are you talking in a gully and the floodplain is 50 feet horizontally? We don't have to go 120 feet on either side still?
That's right. So all of this only applies within the floodplain. If the floodplain is only 50 feet wide, then none of this applies beyond 50 feet from the stream. Okay. If the floodplain only goes 50 feet out from a stream, none of this discussion applies to beyond 50 feet. Now imagine if the floodplain goes out 300 feet. All of this discussion applies to the entire 300 feet away from the stream, except that if you're within 170 feet of the stream, the mitigation requirements are more intense.
Okay,
So
I got it.
there's no buffer outside of the floodplain. There's there's the floodplain, and there's the innermost 170 feet on either side of a stream within that floodplain.
Jared, I may have an example in our maps for you to look at, and maybe you could answer the question based on this map as well. But Christy, I need you to enable sharing for me. Okay. I'll get there if you want to continue on.
Is there another question while we wait?
I have a question. So just to clarify this, if it's not within the 100-year floodplain, which has just been, what, recently updated or to be updated or is updated?
I think in 2018, it may have been the last
Okay.
update.
So if it is not within that floodplain, we have our riparian zone ordinances, and outside of the floodplain, 1 foot outside of that floodplain, this mitigation rule does not apply. This
Yeah, outside of that
development does not apply.
floodplain, the developed space, impervious surface, tree protection does not apply.
Okay.
In the model ordinance, yeah. Does not apply.
Garrett, couple of questions. First of all, do property owners who are in the flood zone currently know that they're in the flood zone?
Yes.
Probably, yeah, they probably do, because they have to pay for, most of them have to pay for flood insurance, being in the flood zone.
So there's some mechanism that lets those people know when they're insuring their property that they're in the flood zone. The second question is quite different. It seems as if both of these approaches, the two that you recommend us consider, in addition to the hybrid, adopting the model floodplain ordinance or having applicants do their own habitat assessments, require a great deal of expertise to determine whether or not they are compliant. They've done all this work. Either they send something in and we have to determine that they're within their rights associated with the model floodplain ordinance, or they've sent in something that an engineer developed for them. But now it's the city's responsibility to assess whether or not that's compliant, or does FEMA provide a service that allows us to determine if it's compliant? Seems like a lot of work that we're not very qualified to do.
That's right. So this is a common scenario with a lot of technical issues in development. It's not unique to this, but yes, there's applicants would be hiring professionals to make determinations that they're compliant, and then it's up to staff to make their best effort to see if there's any serious gaps in logic, red flags, ask questions earnestly. But staff of local governments, whether it's reading a geological hazard report for a shoreline bulkhead to protect someone from erosion, or reading a biological report about salmon habitat impacts, we absolutely rely on the applicant's professional to do their due diligence and make their assessment. And so, yeah, there's small communities all over that have to do it that way. One of the important components of that typically is making sure that we're specifying the kind of information we need in the reports and specifying the kind of professionals that have to prepare them. And I would say that this model ordinance is light on that kind of guidance compared to many other ordinances that are, particularly like for geologic hazard reports for beach and dune development, where there's often like a bit more guidance about the kind of information that they have to present to demonstrate compliance, and it provides guidance to the professional that the applicant hires. Yeah.
Question. So if we chose the model ordinance, are we able to personalize it a little bit with some of what you were just referring to? Say we want to use a biologist for this, some assessment or gathering some information, or an engineer. I mean, can we make it our own in that way?
Yeah. So I can't say what the limits of FEMA's tolerance will be for modifications, but it seems logical to me that as long as the edits aren't subverting the intent of the ordinance, and that it helps us implement what they want, then that kind of thing would be allowed. And we would be asking them to review the draft ordinance before adopting it anyway. So even the model ordinance requires us to insert some like particulars about the city of Gearhart, like the flood maps that we have, whether we require people to build, to the base flood elevation or 1 foot above it. There's some things that are unique to every local government that you have to put into the model ordinance. And I think it would be fair to ask for other changes as well. I wouldn't be too interested in making changes, other changes that try to make that could have the effect of making it easier to impact salmon habitat or making it harder to hold applicants accountable for mitigation. But when it comes to requirements like specifying what a professional has to put in their report to make sure that we're doing this right, that, you know, sounds like the kind of thing that they would be okay with.
I just wondered if there's a way to recover the costs for extra staff time for some of the work that will need to be done. Is there a way to build in some way to bring money in during the process to cover that?
No one has identified, FEMA and VLCD have not identified any source of material support. They do plan on providing technical assistance in the form of workshops and potentially, you know, I would hope commenting on draft materials that we send them, but no one's offered money.
Can we charge higher fees to developer for that type of review?
You have the authority to establish, reasonable fees for any development permit process. And you have the authority to require that if we need to hire a professional to review an application, that we can recuperate that cost from the applicant. But that's an action you would have to take. Yeah.
Preston?
Here, as I'm looking at this map, you know, everything that's in blue. The only thing that I see where salmon have historically been active is the Neocossi Creek.
Yeah.
Okay, if you look to the east, that drainage just on the west side of Highway 101, that appears and disappears and appears and disappears. When you get east of the highway, the largest floodplain we've got there was generated when they put the airport in. It just backed up the outflow of Cullowhee Lake, the southern outflow of Cullowhee Lake. I happen to live in 1998, I bought my property off of McCormick Gardens Road, and FEMA required that I have flood insurance. And then about 6 years later, they dropped that requirement. So even though I've kept my flood insurance up, in the 07 storm, I had water 3/4 of the way up my driveway.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is why is FEMA including that if it's 170 feet from the stream, which I'm in? Why did they drop my flood insurance requirement?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. All I can say I think there's two thoughts that come to mind. One is that in the opinion of FEMA and the National Marine Fisheries Service, the entire floodplain is from time to time or occasionally salmon habitat, and that it makes me think that this is one of the reasons why offering habitat assessment as an option for applicants could be worthwhile, because they could potentially hire someone to say, you know, this is how infrequently salmon use this area, i.e., you know, never, except maybe there's some potential every 100 years. And, you know, the mitigation that we're going to propose for the conceivable impacts in this development is really going to be minimal to reflect that reality. Now, unfortunately, they'd still have to probably hire someone to say that. You know, maybe as time goes on, other communities, you know, within a year of this stuff taking effect, will have gained a lot of experience processing these permits compared to the city of Gearhart's experience. You know, maybe we'll get an application next year, or maybe we'll get 5, I don't know, or none, right? But there's going to be a lot of lessons that get learned in the next year about how these work. And I think that offering people as many options as possible could be worthwhile. Or, another way to think about it is like, let's just keep it really simple for now and see how it works elsewhere. And then we can offer habitat assessments later on. In terms of, trying to argue with FEMA about whether the rules should be applicable there, that's, we're here to serve and we'll take direction from you, but that's not like in the list of options that I'm recommending.
And Councilor Devereaux, I just was looking at the flood maps on your property. You don't have any structures in the flood zone. So that's probably why you're not required to have flood insurance, just part of your driveways in the flood zone. And Garrett, if you needed an example, I have the ability to share maps now.
Let's get one more question and then we'll look at the map, okay? Eric?
So Garrett, in the packet, we have in the letter to Carrie Smith, they point out that there are currently 143 flood insurance policies in our community. So I take it those, this is only for applications going forward. It does not have impact on current policy holders.
This would apply to any, where this applies is irrespective of policy or no policy. So this applies to new development, or it applies to development in the floodplain. So development, as they've defined it, is a new house. It could be like a new house. That's new development. It could also be making your driveway larger. It could be, filling in a low, muddy area that is driving you crazy with a bunch of dirt from, a local contracting company. So these are things that fill space or they add impervious surfaces. And it applies to those things.
Okay.
Yeah. Whether you have a policy or not. Yeah.
Question, but does it not, didn't the beginning of this from FEMA, didn't it say something about if we don't get into compliance, we risk losing the FEMA protected flood insurance period, which would affect the 143 landowners.
That's right. It would make, that's right. The consequences are not irrespective of what kind of flood insurance policy you have. Yeah, it would make property owners, whether you have an existing flood insurance policy or not, and whether you're in the floodplain or not, because people get flood insurance policies who are not in the official floodplain because they know that there is also flood risk outside of floodplains. It would make them ineligible for federally subsidized flood insurance. You could still get flood insurance, but it wouldn't be subsidized by the federal government. And there's some other consequences as well in terms of eligibility for disaster assistance from FEMA after a flood.
I have another question. How much of what we're talking about tonight has to do with what we did at Planning Commission a month ago? You had a model floodplain regulation review tool that had been submitted to FEMA with the draft ordinance that we went through, or you had gone through and made changes. Did that just not include the part that we're talking about tonight having to do with the habitat part?
Yeah, so that's different. It turns out it's related. So that was more than a month ago. It was before FEMA told us about these imminent requirements. In 2023, FEMA came to the city of Gearhart along with DLCD and notified us that our existing flood hazard ordinance, regardless of this habitat requirement, is not compliant with the minimum requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program. And so earlier this year, staff prepared amendments to the flood hazard ordinance to make it compliant with FEMA's minimum requirements so that we could maintain good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program and stay compliant with Oregon Goal 7 on natural hazards. And so we proposed these edits and we brought them to Planning Commission as a initial discussion item. This was, we didn't get to hearings. And then I think it was a matter of just a couple weeks later, FEMA told us about these new requirements. And so the implication now is that if you choose to go the route of adopting the model ordinance, that addresses both issues. The model ordinance will bring us up to minimum compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program in every way. If you want to adopt the habitat assessment guidelines, if you wanted to require habitat assessments but not do it with the model ordinance for whatever reason, we would still have to meet those requirements that they identified in 2023. And so we'd like to combine. We'd like to address both issues at once instead of in sequence. And so at the very least, if you don't want to adopt this model ordinance that's right here with the habitat requirements in it, we would still probably come back recommending that you adopt the last version of the model ordinance that existed about a month ago. And we'd start with that as the baseline of what we're going to update to, and we'd add in provisions for habitat assessment guidelines to the model ordinance that FEMA and the state of Oregon have been offering for a few years now before the Endangered Species Act topic was incorporated into it. So I think that those amendments that we proposed to Planning Commission earlier this summer, we'd probably just put aside, and we'd be starting with either the old model ordinance or this newest one that just came out a few weeks ago with the habitat requirements in it.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Russ, a question. So if we do the model ordinance, aren't we putting the burden on you to interpret an applicant's, whether they're in compliance or not? I mean,
yes, they're staff decisions, unless they're applying for a variance, and then it's a Planning Commission decision.
Okay. So
and the same with habitat assessment guidelines, with requiring habitat assessments, that would be staff interpretation.
right, but if we have habitat assessment, then aren't they having to provide scientific data that backs up their application? Where the model puts it all on you, it sounds like to me.
Oh, I think in both cases they have to provide an applicant would typically have to provide some technical professional based information. For example, if you're adding impervious surface, like a building or driveway in floodplain under the model ordinance, you have to demonstrate how you're managing the stormwater runoff from that development. And unless I could see in some cases very minimal, like a very small thing like a shed or a little driveway turnout, you could maybe demonstrate that without the assistance of a professional. But there's engineering calculations involved in estimating stormwater flows and stormwater infiltration, and designing stormwater management facilities. So yeah, and the model ordinance, refers to it says that, a qualified professional has to design the stormwater facility, for example, or the mitigation has to be designed by a qualified professional. As a staff person, I would prefer that it's a bit more specific, in some ways, but, specifying what kind of a qualified professional. But I'm also comfortable telling an applicant, even if the ordinance doesn't say that it has to be a registered professional engineer, like I would be okay telling an applicant it has to be a registered professional engineer in the state of Oregon. Yeah.
So,
Garrett, since they have already visited us, do you think they'll have some type of audit system in place for our staff decisions?
They have they have systems in place no matter what, and whether they visited us or not. I would say that if for some reason, there's a fifth option, right, that I didn't review, and that's to sit on this and wait and see what other people do. And there's like variations of that, right? Like adopt a temporary moratorium on floodplain development. And beyond that, we're going to wait a couple months and see how other communities treat this. I think if that's the case, I think we need to move forward with meeting those minimum requirements from 2023. And not delay that as well. So we do need to address that issue. FEMA, the draft amendments that we shared with Planning Commission this summer to address that issue, we shared with FEMA and DLCD for comments, and they haven't responded. And so that's given us some time. And I'm glad they haven't, because ideally we address both issues at the same time, but yeah, they haven't responded to that. So that's the ball's in their court, I think. But I don't think we should abuse that. I don't think we should abuse that delay. Like if you don't want to move ahead with habitat protections for a little while, I think we should make an earnest effort to address the other issue in the meantime from 2023. That's about basic safety issues in the floodplain and developing property in a way that's not putting people and property and structures at risk of flooding.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Dana now and then Eric.
So Garrett, first of all, thank you for working on this, because this you know how stressful this has been for me, because I'm hearing some stuff that makes me nervous, and some of it you've already answered the questions. But I'm imagining that I'm living in one of the houses along the Neocoxy, and up until now, I've not had to get a permit to put in pavers or to do simple things to my property. And now we're saying, well, if you do that, you have to go get a professional. Does anybody know where am I going to get this professional? Who's this professional going to be? Where am I going to locate him? Are there a lot of those thick on the ground in Clatsop County, or are we talking about everybody's going to be fighting for the same guys to come out from Portland?
Yeah, so there's no professional that's followed these requirements yet, right? Everybody's going to be doing it for the first time. I would say that there's an abundance of professionals with the kinds of skills you would need, and there's a lot of professionals that are used to doing this kind of thing in Washington, because it does remind me a lot of their requirements for local government protections for salmon habitat and wetlands. And local governments have to be careful about recommending or endorsing
Right. Well,
contractors. But yeah, I mean, that'll be a challenge for every community.
Okay.
As they
So we need to be realistic about that when we're talking to people about that. But then my second question comes on so we're going to have a lot of people that are not going to be aware of these changes and never had to get a permit before to throw in a couple of pavers to create a walkway from their driveway to their garage door or whatever. And we don't have a dedicated code enforcement person here. What kind of problems could we potentially see as a city if somebody is not compliant with this and we're not out there enforcing it?
We could get a community assistance visit from FEMA where they document that somehow they found out about it and that our good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program is at risk. And then we could ultimately be removed from the National Flood Insurance Program. I mean, I would say you know, the pavers example, like that stuff's going to happen in every community. Like people are going to do
Right.
some landscape. People are going to do some landscaping, right? I think the issue comes in when they are preparing for like a twice
deck.
annual a twice annual community assistance visit, which because they do them with everybody, or not twice annual, excuse me, like biannual every couple of years, and they do, you know, some review of our floodplain permits. The primary way that we could go wrong is by issuing is when someone applies for a permit and we issue it and there's a record of that without applying the habitat requirements. I mean, maybe they're looking at aerial imagery, and if they saw like a new house or a new driveway, it's like that stands out. They could be like, "Hey, what happened here? Where's the permit for that? Did you apply the habitat requirements?" I mean, ultimately, the consequence is all participation in the National Flood Insurance Program and the things that flow from that. And
So I guess my takeaway is whatever we decide, we're going to have to really communicate with the public about these changes, because there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be impacted by this that may not know how this is going to change what they can and cannot do on their property. And then the other comment, I guess, is just a comment, is that if we're going to do a hybrid, in my experience, when you're doing regulations, you're usually okay if you're more restrictive than what they've asked for. But if you try to be less restrictive, that's where you're going to run into the problem. So if we take their model ordinance and then we add to it, we're probably okay. But if we try to get around some of the things that they're pushing for, that's going to be a problem. Is that your assessment also?
yeah, I think if we want to go a hybrid approach, that the ordinance would say that applicants shall identify which of the following right pathways they're following, and like they have to say which one they're doing and can't mix and match for one proposal, and it's part of the application. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of extra work that we have to do associated with this. We have to, we'll have to change our floodplain development application form so that it asks for the right information. And, there'll be extra communication with other staff, like the building official, make sure that we're all aware and on the same page about the requirements. Yeah.
Okay, Eric has got a question, then we'll go to the map, if you still want to go over the map with us. But we are scheduled to be done, and I'd like to do that.
So Garrett, how do you actually achieve no net loss of habitat function? If somebody wants to put in a driveway or build a house, you're filling in space and you're putting in impervious surfaces. How do you remove them somehow? How does that get removed somewhere else to create no net loss?
That's a great question. And, if you read the ordinance and really think about how that's going to work for somebody, it's going to be challenging. They can remove impervious if there's an existing impervious surface on their site. Let's look at impervious surfaces. If there's an existing impervious surface on their site, for whatever reason, that'll be rare, right? Someone just left a big slab of concrete. They could remove that to partially meet the mitigation requirements. For impervious surfaces, there's also the option to treat the stormwater so that it matches, so that the runoff from your development matches the pre-development runoff. And so you can do that with stormwater management facilities, typically engineered, like a bioswale or an infiltration basin or retention basin. These things are designed by engineers and landscape architects. And there's calculations involved where they can demonstrate that they're managing the stormwater on this site as if it was not developed. Or if you have two properties in town, you could remove impervious surface from another one that's in the floodplain. Or you can pay someone else to remove impervious surface from their property if it's in the floodplain. So, increasingly unlikely scenarios there. The developed space requirement, that's the one where it becomes a bit, where I'm really wondering how, it'll be harder for people to meet that. So that seems to say that you cannot add volume of material to the floodplain below the flood elevation. And unlike the impervious surface requirement where you can just manage the stormwater, I mean, that's the practical pathway for impervious surfaces, is you manage the stormwater. I don't know how you remove developed volume, from your floodplain. You could maybe remove earth material, remove other earth material and have it taken away from your property to compensate for the volume of the building you're building. Or you, like I said, I mean, if you have two properties in the floodplain, you could remove volume from the other one, or pay someone else to do it on another property.
Is that good enough for you, Art?
Yeah, that's good enough for all of us. I mean, how do you literally do this?
That's, I don't think anyone's got an idea.
I get it on the impervious surfaces, that, you actually have some potential engineering solution.
Right.
But the undeveloped space thing, that's.
Couldn't you?
And that's another one where it makes me, it makes me drawn to the habitat assessment guidelines as an option for people. Because whereas the model ordinance would require a 1-to-1 or greater removal of volume of material from the space, maybe if you follow the habitat assessment guidelines, your professional can demonstrate that that's not really required, and that's doing that isn't providing like as much habitat protection as the ordinance would make you think it is.
If you can find the professional.
If you can find the professional.
And afford him, yeah.
Yeah, and afford it.
Okay, can we look at that map real quick and then, I don't know what we gotta do. Talk amongst ourselves and give a hint that we wanna go this way or that?
I think it's to the city council to tell the planning commission how they would like to proceed.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it easier on us.
Right. So we've gotta wait until September.
It is
Or-
September.
No, October's meeting. Are
It
we-
says, no, in his timeline, it says, that planning commission hearing will be November 14th.
Right.
So you have to make a decision in time for, Angelina to get that information.
Right.
To the newspaper, so.
And that's 7 days, right?
No, it's 21 days, 21 days, before the meeting,
Before
Yeah.
the meeting.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
so-
if we're making an earnest effort to keep the conversation moving, that's okay. I mean, if we can talk about it at the next city council meeting in October, maybe more questions come up there and we're not able to even get to planning commission at the next meeting, but as long as we're earnestly working on this, I think it's okay. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the map is on the screen.
These are the maps that are available on the cityofgearhart.com site. And anybody can get into it. So here is beautiful city of Gearhart. I'm kind of noodling into the area between near 2nd Street and Summit Avenue. And if I go down onto the catalog over here, and I find FEMA flood layers, and then I turn on the FEMA flood zone area overlay. Zone X in the greenish yellow is outside the 100-year flood zone. Zone AE is in the 100-year. I'm gonna come in here on the Second Street piece of property here. These pieces of property here are entirely in the flood zone. And then to show the difference, we've got the Neocoxie Creek here, and we've got the Summit Avenue properties on the right-hand side, which there is an elevation change of approximately 20 to 25 feet from the creek to the Summit Avenue. My concern was that the 170-foot zone, which would be from mean high tide of the creek about here, would extend
Nobody's made it clear that it ends at the flood zone.
all the way to here, but then again, that was my concern. Now it is that it would end at the flood zone. But in looking at.
On the west side, don't want to extend it halfway through that area?
On the west side, if I took approximate mean high tide, went 170 feet, we're about there.
Okay.
So if somebody
And
wanted to
again-
develop in there, their mitigation would be more difficult.
How many lots in is that? Close to 100, so
It's
it's
170
two lots or
feet,
three.
yeah.
Where's the ridge pad?
Two, three
Path
2-3 lots depending on how.
is right here.
I thought it was the edge of the floodplain and 170 feet. It's just 170 feet from the mean height.
I think from
Habitat.
streams.
In the stream.
Habitat assessments and the model ordinance would be required throughout the floodplain, throughout the blue area. Within 170 feet of the stream, like Chad was measuring with his
Okay,
pointer, the mitigation requirements are greater.
all right, okay, I got it.
Mitigation light and mitigation strong.
right.
Garrett, do they differentiate between the waters that are included in the aquatic zone versus not in the aquatic zone? Are they making any differentiation between those two areas or?
It's the same, except that they define the 170-foot distance as being from mean higher high water instead of the ordinary high water mark. So, I mean, yeah, but either way, it ends at the floodplain. So only the blue area. This only applies at all to places in the blue.
So if you had a piece of property that on the previous map that was within that 170 and there was no, you basically couldn't build it. Is that the presumption?
Could be.
Well, if you can figure out how to build it under the model ordinance, then you could build on it. You just have to mitigate for the requirements. And that's where we were talking earlier about how mitigation for developed space could be quite challenging. But you can develop, there's not a development prohibition within 170 feet. It's just that you have to mitigate more. You have to, you have to plant more trees to compensate for the trees that you cut down. You have to remove more volume of material for material that you're adding. And frankly, if you're within 170 feet of the stream, and increasingly as you get closer, if you want to build within, let's say you want to go up to the edge of what's our current riparian buffer, because you could today build up to, I think, 50 feet of the stream, but not closer than that. The habitat assessment that your professional does is gonna require more intense mitigation for development that's closer to the stream, probably, logically speaking, all other things being equal. Yeah.
So that mitigation would all fall on the developer?
Yeah, yes.
Can we zoom in on the Pack Way property on the fire station area?
And there's Dollar General. There's that property.
Are you talking about the Ordway property?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I'd like to see the existing, I'm sorry, I'd like to see the existing location too.
Oh,
And
sorry.
even perhaps the school area, just so we can kind of get an idea. I'm having a hard time. I'm not working under the best circumstances here because I can't see very well, but
This is the current location.
okay.
It's firmly in the zone X, away from AE. And then the school has some AE on the west side. A little bit north off the property.
Okay.
You're
And
right,
the-
Jen.
And Ordway has nothing.
Nothing.
Okay.
Carrie, I have one quick question.
Okay,
Garrett, does, on the west side of the creek, as you mentioned, like, let's say building a fence on your property, which would be in the flood plain, is that considered, development?
Yes.
Currently, we would not allow that in the 50-foot flowing zone. So we do prevent people from building fences in this blue area now. Well, actually.
Outside of the 50-foot zone?
Even farther up from the blue area, for example.
One more
And I
question. Go ahead, Gary.
I was gonna say, I expect some more guidance on like practical minimum thresholds. Like a fence, that actually is impervious and has a horizontal surface area, but it's completely absurd to think of that as something that generates stormwater runoff, right? And maybe it also wouldn't be considered in terms of volume calculations, but I think we need to hear more from FEMA on their expectations for things like that.
okay. Is everyone happy here?
Many people got in this room.
Yeah. Garrett, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Just to clarify, you're expecting, you'd like, a discussion at the next at the next city council meeting in the first week of October, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Directions will be coming.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, Garrett.
Hey, Chad.
Thank you, Garrett.
I get to that map again.
Garrett, looks like you'll be fighting a cold.
Recording